Logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal in a Cold War than logic and reason. These are the words of Dr. Joost Meerloo, a Dutch psychiatrist who survived Nazi occupation and later studied how governments and institutions control people's minds. His book here is called The Rape of the Mind, The Psychology of Thought Control and Menticide. It explores how menticide, which is the deliberate destruction of a person's or a group's ability to think critically through manipulation, how menticide takes hold. And today, this book is more relevant than ever. Hey, I'm Jeff Nelson, and today I'm going to show you how to recognize propaganda and mind control tactics so you can think for yourself and avoid becoming a victim of manipulation. Now, you might be thinking, mind control, that sounds kind of extreme, but it's happening all the time, and sometimes so subtly that we often don't notice it. From advertising to politics to public health campaigns, these techniques are used daily to influence our thoughts and actions. The same methods that sell products or promote patriotism can also push harmful policies. And the key is to recognize when someone is trying to manipulate your thinking so you can decide for yourself what to believe. Here are the three pillars of propaganda and mind control. They're fear, repetition, and confusion. I'm going to break down each tactic with real examples. Once you understand how they work, their power over you fades. Let's start with the most powerful, fear. Fear is essential for mind control because of how it affects your brain. When you're scared, the limbic system, your brain's survival center, takes over, suppressing the prefrontal cortex, which handles logic, planning, and moral reasoning. This isn't a flaw. It's how humans survived. When you're facing a tiger, you don't want to stand there analyzing its stripes. Throughout history, fear has been weaponized. During the Cold War, both sides used the threat of nuclear annihilation to control their populations. And in the 1950s, Americans built fallout shelters and children practiced duck and cover drills. Was the nuclear threat real? Yes. But the constant emphasis on fear made people much more compliant with government policies and less likely to question authorities. We saw this fear technique employed during COVID-19. For example, early in the pandemic, media outlets reported showing footage of what they said were overwhelmed New York hospitals. But this later was shown to be footage from another place and time. And that footage helped to stoke fear. Other examples, infection rates and death tolls constantly flashed on TV screens, but there was little or no context about these things, like testing accuracy. We later learned the COVID test could be extremely inaccurate. And there were no comparisons to previous years' mortality rates from flu so that the public might see whether there was actually any significant increase during COVID. Mind control was even admitted by governments. This article from the United Kingdom talks about how the public was manipulated to be locked down. Its title was Use of Fear to Control Behavior in COVID Crisis Was Totalitarian, Admit Scientists. And the article says scientists on a committee that encouraged the use of fear to control people's behavior during the COVID pandemic have admitted its work was unethical and totalitarian. Members of the Scientific Pandemic Influence Group on Behavior expressed regret about the tactics in a new book about the role of psychology in the government's COVID-19 response. The head of Facebook revealed he was forced to censor people to keep the government's narrative from being contradictory. Fear also drives consumer behavior. Remember the toilet paper shortage? That was fear making people act irrationally. So remember to ask yourself, are they trying to inform you or control you? When you're genuinely protecting people, you provide accurate information and trust them to make their own decisions. But when the goal is to control, fears are manipulated and alternative viewpoints are suppressed. Keeping people in a constant state of anxiety allows authorities to manipulate behavior on a large scale, often by creating artificial scarcity and urgency. So the antidote to fear-based manipulation is simple, but it's not easy. When you're afraid, pause and ask yourself, who benefits from my fear? What information might be missing? Are they showing me the full picture? The second pillar of mind control is repetition, and there's some fascinating science behind why it works so well. Your brain has a built-in shortcut. It tends to accept as true the things it hears most often. This made perfect sense in our evolutionary past. If everyone in your tribe kept saying there were dangerous animals, up in the North Valley, it was probably true. You didn't need to go verify it personally. Your subconscious mind keeps track of messages and which ones are most frequent. The quantity or repetition means your brain assumes the message must be true, even if it's complete nonsense. This is why mind control experts ensure that the same information is broadcast across all media platforms over and over: TV, radio, newspapers, social media, even in entertainment. We saw this in COVID being used heavily with phrases like, "We're all in this together," or "Follow the science." These weren't spontaneous slogans. They were carefully crafted messages repeated again and again and again across all platforms. Control of the media is essential in any psychological operation. During COVID, for instance, you saw a flood of virus-related content across all channels. Movies like the 2011 film Contagion were heavily featured on platforms like Netflix, further priming the population to accept certain narratives about viruses and vaccines. This technique is called psychological priming, or sometimes predictive programming, or a future triggering of dormant programming. It's using entertainment and media to prepare people to respond in certain ways when real-world events occur. By saturating the airwaves with consistent messaging, people unconsciously adopt these ideas as their own. Censorship is also a critical aspect of repetition, because if people start questioning and contradicting the repetition, pointing out it's exaggerated or not true, that can cancel out the effects of repetition. So it's super important for manipulators to control speech and only let one set of ideas reach the public. COVID was an example of the power of repetition, and we can see other narratives like the global warming narrative is being managed in a similar way. There was an undercover hidden camera interview of a technical director at CNN. He talks about a plan from the highest level of the network to move from COVID to making a flood of information about global warming to create fear with this repetition.
Once the public will be open to it, we're going to start focusing mainly on climate like global warming, and like that's going to be our next it's going to be our focus. So our next thing is going to be for climate change awareness.
What does that look like?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I have a feeling it's just going to be like constantly showing videos of like decline in ice and weather warming up and like the effects it's having on the economy, and really diving into
that.
The head of the network,
Who's that? Is that Zucker?
Zucker, yeah. I imagine that he's got his council and they've all discussed where they think
so that's like the next
pandemic story that will beat to death. But that one's got longevity.
Do you think it's going to be just a lot of fear, climate?
Yeah, fear sells.
So fear sells. Repetition is more powerful than ever because social media creates echo chambers where we hear the same messages over and over. The algorithms actually amplify this effect by showing us more of what we've already seen. Part of the repetition is trying to create a notion that a consensus exists. It can be manufactured, it can be untrue, but repetition is the key to make people believe things. Here's what can make repetition so effective. It works even when we know it's happening. Just like you can't help memorizing a song that plays too often, repeated messages sink in whether we want them or not. The defense against repetition is consciousness and diversity of information sources. When you notice the same message everywhere, ask yourself, who's coordinating this? What other viewpoints aren't being shown? Why this message? Why now? Is there any research that we're seeing being funded? Is the other side of the question being funded? So the third pillar of mind control is confusion, and this might be the most insidious because it literally short circuits our ability to think clearly. When your brain encounters contradictory information, something interesting happens. Like a computer trying to process incompatible commands, it can enter a state of cognitive overload. And just like your brain's response to fear, this overwhelm causes people to become more susceptible to direction from authority figures. The classic example is from George Orwell's world of doublethink, the idea that you can simultaneously believe two contradictory things like war is peace or freedom is slavery. But Orwell, he wasn't writing fiction. It's a real psychological manipulation technique. Look at how the tobacco industry used confusion as their response to research that was emerging, showing that smoking might be dangerous.
Tens of thousands of doctors in all parts of the country, in every state of the union. Doctors in every branch of medicine were asked, "What cigarette do you smoke, doctor?" In this nationwide survey of general practitioners, surgeons, throat specialists, diagnosticians, and so on, the brand named most was Camel.
Yes, according to this survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
Big Tobacco paid doctors to smoke on camera, and they said there was a consensus towards smoking a particular brand, listing all the different types of doctors who agreed, while simultaneously arguing that no studies definitively proved smoking caused cancer. So this left people confused, enough to keep smoking despite mounting evidence of harm. During COVID, we saw numerous confusing directives. Masks weren't necessary, then they were essential. Then we needed multiple masks. The virus was deadly enough that the government had to close small shops, but not large retail chains. You could have 10 people at your home gathering, but if you had 11 or more, then the virus knew to come and get you. In Canada, the virus apparently knew to become active only after 10 p.m. when the curfews took place. Plastic barriers in grocery stores and arrows on the floor ensured you were safe from the virus, right? Perhaps most confusing of all, people who died within 28 days of being vaccinated, they were categorized by the government as being unvaccinated. So the media reported that the unvaccinated were dying, trying to downplay at the same time the fact that many who died had taken the shot, but were being counted as unvaccinated because of confusing arbitrary government rules. All of this confusion is intentional, and we see it a lot. Think about how often we hear contradictory economic news. Inflation is under control and prices are soaring. That's in the same broadcast. Or the job market is super strong, and then we hear hundreds of thousands are losing their jobs and we're headed for a recession. Here's what Dr. Meerloo wrote about this. He said, "While the enemy is still searching for a reasonable counterargument to the first lie, the totalitarians can assault him with another. Today's digital age has added new confusion tools, fact checkers that contradict each other, expert opinions that reverse weekly, and algorithms that show different people entirely different versions of reality." Confusion is meant to spark an emotional reaction because, again, manipulation is about degrading your ability to think straight. So what happens when you combine all three pillars, fear, repetition, and confusion? You get a population that's very easy to control. The good news is, like any magic trick, once you know how it's done, it loses its power over you. Now, to be fair, propaganda can also be used for good purposes, campaigns aimed at manipulating people not to drive while drunk or to stop smoking. They can save lives. The difference is in transparency and intention. Are they trying to inform and empower you or control and manipulate you? Here are 3 simple ways to protect yourself. When you feel afraid, pause and ask, who benefits from my fear? When you see the same message everywhere, ask yourself what other viewpoints are being silenced. Find out with an open mind what those other viewpoints are. When policies seem contradictory and don't make sense, this is a signal that something is probably not what it appears. And so be very careful with yourself at this point. Think of doctors trying to get people to smoke in the 1950s and 60s, and the many people who then died as a result of following this consensus of these doctors. Remember what Dr. Meerloo said, logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. If the threat is real and obvious, then clear logical information is enough. It's only when the threat is exaggerated or manufactured that these sophisticated control techniques become necessary. If you're being bombarded with intense messaging of fear and the same people are trying to shut up any other perspectives, you should know mind control tactics are being deployed against you. I'm not suggesting you become paranoid or reject all media messages, but for your own safety and for the sake of your loved ones, I'm encouraging you to become an active, conscious consumer of information. Think of it like developing an immune system for your mind. That's what having survival instinct is all about. You don't want to make poor decisions where you end up with blood clots, or you lose your freedom because you were mind controlled against your own interests. Okay, if you found this information valuable, please share it with someone you care about. The more people who understand these techniques, the less effective they become. Remember, knowledge is power, but only when you use it. And speaking of power, in my next video, I'm going to show you exactly what I do to stay strong and healthy, my weekly workout routine combining running and calisthenics, plus what I eat to fuel it. So if you're curious about how to get fit without a gym membership, you won't want to miss that. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.